Today's episode is brought to you by HERdacity. HERdacity is a nonprofit inspiring confidence in women to achieve their professional goals. For resources, networking opportunities, and a strong community of women, visit HERdacity.org to learn more.
Welcome to HERdacious, a podcast for audacious women. Welcome to HERdacious, the podcast for audacious career women looking for a little femme support on their journey. I'm Lorelei, and I'm pleased you chose to join us today because we are going to be discussing the socialization of women and how sometimes we were taught to sabotage each other in lieu of supporting each other. To join me in this epic conversation, I have a professor of social justice and education and a diversity and inclusion consultant, author, and TED Talk speaker, Dr. Joy Wiggins.
Hello.
Pleased you could make it today.
Well, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. The socialization of women. Huge conversation. To kick off the conversation, Joy, I want to ask you the biggest question I have. How are women socialized to view themselves and other women?
Such a great question. So it's my favorite question because I'm so interested in it. And for me, I think I was first interested in this as a little child and just watching the ways in which the messages I got as a little girl. And, I would notice how other women in my life were behaving, how they changed their behavior depending on the context of the situation,
Ooh.
What toys I got,
Right.
What toys I did not get, the clothes I was dressed in. I mean, the simple things, it's the surface things, but that have a deeper meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I really felt that I wanted to dig into this a little bit deeper. And then as I got to college, I started to look at race and how race played a big part and how we've been socialized, especially being from the South, but also being a military brat. I was part of many different cultures. I lived in Germany as a child. I lived in China. I've traveled around. I've lived all over the States. And so just geographically looking at what does that look like across the United States and across global cultures. And, for me, just growing up in that environment, it just really piqued my interest in how we've been socialized. So I think we can look at it a number of different ways and good questions to ask ourselves when we're thinking about, well, why do I act the way I do? Why do I think the way that I do? How do I navigate the world the way that I do? And looking at who we are as individuals and the impact of our race, our ethnicity, our language, our geographic region, our age, the media that we've consumed, the family dynamics, all the different ways in which we have been shaped and molded to be the people that we are today. And it's almost like we've been given a script.
Yeah.
And if we don't look at that script and start to deconstruct it and to say, well, wait a minute, why am I looking in the mirror and saying these things to myself? Or what are these expectations, these shoulds that I'm saying to myself? Rather than looking at that and questioning, well, why am I saying that? Why, for me personally, I've always struggled with my body image. So I look at that when I first came back from Germany as a child, I was in 4th grade, and I looked at trying to be like a cultural chameleon where I would go and look at what was happening in the elementary school that I was a part of and changing the way that I dressed. I came back from Germany in the 1980s, 1984. I was all punked out. I had short hair. My sisters and I all had these cool, punky jumpsuits. We go to San Antonio, Texas, and there's Laura Ashley and Dooney and Burke purses. And we were like, oh, we got to do an about face because we are not going to fit in. We stick out.
In. Yeah.
And so I think for us, we all noticed that we had to shift and we had to change and we had to become these cultural chameleons. And for me, that really piqued my interest in how we're socialized. So if we look at what were the messages that our mothers gave us about what that meant to be a woman, what did that look like if we had working mothers, if we had single mothers, if our mothers were absent? How did we look at father figures in our lives? And what were they doing? And, my parents were very traditional and they were very conservative. And so I just noticed that my mom really was not pursuing the career that she wanted to and her interests because she was following my dad around as a military wife. I just noticed that she was unhappy. And I didn't think my dad was that happy either because he had all this pressure to be a breadwinner and to be this traditional man. And he was a very sensitive guy, super, super sweet. And I just don't think that either one of them were benefiting from the social gender constraints and norms that were put upon them as, baby boomer generation. So I think that was a big part of my interest in socialization and really talking to my students, in teacher education about how do we navigate the world the way that we do? Why do we look at ourselves in certain ways? What is that running commentary that we have about ourselves? And then how does that then land on other women? Because we have expectations for ourselves. And then sometimes if we don't meet those expectations or we're extra hard on ourselves about that, then for me, it's with body image. So I would compare myself to other women. And I thought, well, this beauty norm is skinny, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, white, all of these different things that I saw in magazines. And I thought, well, that's what I have to look like. And then in middle school and sometimes elementary school, we learn to sabotage each other along those lines. And it starts from there. And then as we get older, it becomes other ways in which women can sabotage each other.
Give us a few examples of the types of expectations we are socialized to deal with as women.
Well, I definitely think that body image is one of them. One of them is the expectation of occupations. Many times when we're given little doll toys and we are given messages about be nice, be a caretaker, take care of your brother, take care of your sister. It also sibling order can kind of dictate some of that. But a lot of it is just these messages that we got as far as occupations that we were expected to flow into. And as a teacher educator, I see a lot of white women in the teacher education field or in the teaching field. And, and I'm like, I tell them immediately, I'm like, this is no coincidence that most of you are white female women. We've been socialized to think that this is our occupation. Teachers, nurses, caretakers, nurturers, and not always being, I guess, supported in the science and technology and engineering fields. And so you have to really make a good conscious effort, I think, as a woman to persist in those fields, despite the societal drawbacks or the societal push against that. So that's why you see so many women in STEM organizations, because we're really trying to support women in those fields so that they can pursue the things that they want to pursue. And finance is another one, business. And so really trying to get women in the C-suite, because we're not always nurtured to be leaders.
Right.
And so we have to really support ourselves and support each other and provide the networks and the support for us to be able to do that.
Well, on the topic of support, you mentioned just a moment ago about how we learn to sabotage each other from a young age. What does that sabotage look like in real life as adults?
Well, I think personal relationships, it can look like a variety of different things. And I think it can look like, depending on the lines of difference. So if I look at gender identity, there's this very specific way that women can talk to each other in relationship as friends or as coworkers when we comment on each other's dress or our body image, or, oh, have you lost weight? Or, oh, you look so cute in that dress. Or, and we think that these things are compliments, but they're also, and they, depending on your relationship, they very much are, but we're also keeping each other in check. And yeah, I think this is my opinion, that we keep each other in check. Like, oh, you look so cute. It's important to look cute. What's the subtext there? Oh, you look pretty. It's important to look pretty. You don't hear guys saying, oh, you look so pretty. Right? They don't say that.
You look real fit today, man.
Yeah. You look good. I mean, they do that though, too. I mean, men have their own stuff for sure. And I'll let the men have that conversation. But it's, I think it's definitely, even when we're in the workplace, and the way that my interest in all of this started was because it started with a story of a woman in the elevator telling me that, oh, I've lost so much weight. And my weight has always been an issue for me. So
that must have been a fun conversation.
I tried to get out of that elevator as quickly as possible. I was pressing that button. So, but that started the whole thing, and I just thought, well, why is the topic of my body an issue at work? Why is this a conversation piece at work? Can we just do our work? And I'd love to have conversations about other things, but it was always kind of these surface level, very traditional female type of conversations. And the other thing that I saw happening at my first institution was that when one of our colleagues was pregnant during the interview, she eventually became our colleague, she was pregnant. And I know that that's what we talked about for the majority of the interview, was talking about her pregnancy.
Really?
Yeah. And it really bothered me. And I just thought, why are we still talking about her pregnancy? And then before I was pregnant, I was thinking, and this is a sabotage moment on my part, that, oh my gosh, when she has that baby, all the work is going to lay on me. And, I did think that. And then I had my own child, and so I don't think that way anymore. But, I think that there's also this many different divides for women. And one of them is around children, the maternal wall. The other one is around age, how women can really discriminate and not understand each other and not know how to communicate sometimes across age. And the other one is definitely racial. And I would also say gender identity and sexual orientation. I think that I've noticed as a queer woman that I get funny looks, funny questions. I've been asked, how do I know that we're not on a date right now if I'm just going out for a walk with a friend?
What?
Yeah. I've gotten some really weird questions. And so, and I know that people are asking these questions out of curiosity and just not understanding. And so I'm a little bit more patient with that. But it's also like fodder for podcast conversation as well.
Perfect. Well, I'm listening to you share these examples, and one of the things that immediately comes to mind for me, from my socialization, my background, and the people that have been around me during my life, judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Women feeling that they're allowed to share their judgment of you or about you to you.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Well, society is judging us all the time.
Oh, yeah, we knew that.
So why not keep each other in check? Because
that's the keeping us in check part.
Yes, for sure. Because why does that make me nervous if another woman is not behaving the way society has ordained her to behave? So that could be in a leadership position. She's too aggressive. She's too abrasive. She should be nicer. We're taught to be nice.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're not nice,
warm,
kind, smiling, generous, giving of your time when really you shouldn't be giving your time to people that, unless you're getting compensated most of the time. And a lot of times we don't ask for those types of things. And so women can get irritated with other women when they don't keep each other in check, because it then lands on us as a person. It's like, well, I'm always giving of my time. I'm always nice, and I'm not getting ahead. So she should be nice. She should be doing these other things. Or it could be like the queen bee syndrome, where other women that are maybe older, that have been in the field for longer, they will say to younger women, well, I had to go through the trenches. I had to go through all this hardship, and I had to deal with the harassment. I had to pull myself up by my bootstraps type of mentality.
Do it just like I did.
You have
to
you have to suffer like I did.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to put you through that ringer. The men are not going to just let you walk in here as is. You have to really fight for that. And it's hard for queen bees to understand that it doesn't have to be that way, and that we can actually change the way things are.
That's part of that sabotage?
Absolutely.
How do we get in our own way when it comes to self-sabotage? Because I know we're all guilty of it at some point.
So an activity that I do with my students is to identify the running commentary in your head, to really listen to your thoughts from the moment you wake up. And so something that they have to do for an assignment is to wake up in the morning and just listen to the thoughts that you say to yourself, from looking in the mirror to what you're going to wear. What are you saying to yourself? What are those messages, those little hidden messages that you're saying? And then how are you going out into the world? You're on the highway, you're out on the roads, you're going to your work or your school. What are the judgments you're also giving and thinking about other women that have something to do with you, that have something to do with the way you see yourself and the way you think you should navigate the world? You want to put other women and think, well, they should be doing this too. They should, and for queer folks too, it's hard to be who we are and to be non-binary if we so choose, when there's a lot of judgment around that. We think about, like, what's that? It's Pat. You remember that SNL skit?
I do remember Pat.
So that, that was really derogatory, to be non-binary, to look not fitting of the part, to not look like women, to not have the nails and the hair and the makeup and all of that. And a lot of that can be along gendered, identity lines. And then we look at racial lines. How do we have racial lines, thinking about the angry Black woman and these stereotypical behaviors that we're expecting of women of color, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Camille brings up a great point in our book about the spicy Latina. And she talks about how there's these stereotypes that if you're not following that stereotype, that people will question you on it.
Right, because you're not fitting into what they think they know about who you're supposed to be, and they're not comfortable anymore. So they're going to ask questions and try to push you back into that place where they're comfortable.
Right, exactly. And that's, that goes along with segregation and the way that our policies and our government has segregated us so that we don't really know the nuances of, people along different racial lines. We're all very different. We're all very different people. And, so just because especially right now when we have these D&I conversations and everyone is looking to the Black person in the room to talk about diversity and inclusion, when they're like, no, I'm an engineer. That's not my job. And I don't represent all Black people.
Right.
And it's the same thing for women, right? We don't represent all women.
Right. Well, Joy, can't you just represent all queer folk right now in this conversation? Why not?
Exactly. Because all of our experiences are so different. And because of all those things I said earlier, geographic region and age and linguistic capital, all these different things that we have that identify us as who we are, it's like we're a kaleidoscope. And every shift, every experience that we have shifts us in a very specific way around our identity. And so it's like we're all kaleidoscopes. And one experience just a shift of that kaleidoscope, that experience will then impact us and how we see the world.
That's beautiful. Oh, I love that. Well, I want to dovetail really quickly off of your last point. How does implicit bias play a role in these sabotaging behaviors?
Well, that stems from our socialization to the way we see the world, to the way we see others, and those subtle messages of implicit bias being that we might have those stereotypical thoughts because we haven't had a lot of experience across racial or gender identity or ethnicity identities. And so we may not have that much experience with each other. And so we just rely on those stereotypes. We fall back on those. And implicit bias and microaggressions basically is when we might have a particular idea about who another woman is, say a Black woman. And if we have a stereotype that because she's raising issues around maybe diversity and inclusion or maybe just any kind of issue, and the perception of that stereotype of angry Black woman is that like, oh, look, she's getting angry. Or you don't have to get angry. And that's a microaggression by saying that to them. So for me, I was in a meeting once and we were divided along gender lines. And the women were not agreeing with what the men wanted to do around an event. They wanted to do another event. And the women were saying, that's too much on our plate. We all knew as women that we were going to be the ones sidelined with all of the stuff, all of the food and the event type of things. And the men were like, no, we can just do it. And we knew that one of their assistants, who was a woman, was going to be saddled with all the real hard work and labor. And so we were trying to save her from that. So we were like, no, we're not going to do this. And I was the chair of the committee along with another woman. And we both said, if you all want to do the event, go ahead, but we are not going to help you. And the men were like, fine, we'll just go ahead and do it. And at the end of the year, when we tried to have a conversation with the men about it, one of them wouldn't show up and the other one called us dramatic. Oh. And he goes, well, you all got very dramatic. And I said, okay, so let's talk about what the word dramatic means and how it's landing on us as women. Women have been put on stakes and burned to death, being called witches, just for expressing our opinions, just for standing up and saying something, or just for being different, going against the norm. We have also been put in mental institutions and have been lobotomized and have been told we're crazy and dramatic. And so these words have deep-rooted history and ramifications for women. So when you call us dramatic, you need to know your history of what that term really means to us. And the word crazy, psycho, all of that.
Hysterical
is a good one, right? And so all of that. So the guy said, oh, I didn't realize that. I go, well, now you do. And, I just checked him. And I said it in a very nice way. But the women came up to me afterwards and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that he said that. And you could just feel it in the room that they were bristling.
Right. And the generations of burden just landed on them with the label of dramatic.
It really got to us. And so I think that, just simply saying, hey, you may not know this, but let's check your implicit bias, because that was his implicit bias. And this is a social justice committee that we were on, so nobody's immune to it.
Well, on that note, we are not immune to a sponsor break. We'll be right back.
Hi, Barbie here from Moonray, husband and wife indie pop duo. If you enjoy the intro music, we invite you to listen to our debut EP, Honeymoon, streaming now on all platforms. Visit www.moonray-music.com for more.
And we're back with Dr. Joy Wiggins talking about sabotage and supportive behaviors by women. So Joy, let's transition over to the support side of the conversation. Where do we start?
So we have to really start to take a good look at the things that we're saying to ourselves, the messages, the negative self-talk that we perhaps are saying to ourselves. The more graceful and compassionate we are with ourselves, the more graceful and compassionate we'll be with other women. So first, ourselves. How do we start to empower ourselves? We can't ask other people to do that for us. We have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're better able to create the capacity to empower other women when you yourself have felt empowered.
Excellent. Well, how do we take that supportive, loving, graceful self-support and transition that into the workspaces as professionals?
So I think a few things that you can do is to understand our history. And as we start to transition from our self-empowerment to other women, what's the history of the women's movement? And in our book, we talk about that. The chapter 1 is our feminist history and looking at all of the women that have been doing the work that have been marginalized. And that's along racial lines. The Black feminist movement, the womanist movement, Indigenous women's movement, the Asian American women, mujerista, all these women that have been doing this work for women, understanding our history, and so that we can better understand that the women around us, no matter how different we are, we all have a stake in all of us coming together in solidarity, rather than us trying to do this as individuals. And so understanding our history is a really, really important piece to that. When we get into the workplace, then understanding, okay, if this other woman is sitting across from me and we're in a meeting and she's said something, how do we amplify her voice? How do we come together and strategically talk to one another about how we're going to lift each other up and be very strategic about it?
Let's get into the nitty-gritty of the strategic support.
One of the pieces of that is looking at the gender pay gap. At this point, I think it's become pretty well known that women of color, Black women and Latinx women and Asian American women and Indigenous women are all paid very differently than white women. And so that gender pay gap along racial lines is important to understand, and it's important to be transparent in the workplace about what the pay actually looks like. And universities as public institutions have to show what people are making. They do. And I think that should also apply to corporate and businesses. So that's one way. Looking at the policies around family leave policy, and is it fair? Is it giving men also the opportunity for paternal leave? And what's the expectations around that? What's the accountability of the organization or business? So if they have a diversity statement, they need to actually have accountability measures that talks about how they are being more inclusive. A lot of times, the reasons that you'll have these diversity and inclusion statements on a company's website, but there's no accountability behind it, and they're not really showing, this is what we've done, this is what we plan to do, and this is how we are going to hold ourselves accountable to it. And this is what, our employee resource groups are doing, and this is how we're listening to them. So, if your organization does not have an ERG, they need to get one, and maybe you're the one to spearhead that. So it's a lot of us, looking at where do we have pockets of power within our organizations and using that and wielding that and capitalizing on that in order to create the equity in the workplace that we want to see.
Excellent. So what can I, as an individual woman cruising about my career, do today to start making a difference, going from sabotage to support, not just of myself, but to my fellow femmes?
Well, I think one of them is to what I just said as far as looking at what your organization is doing, just getting a good understanding of some of these policies. And what are we looking at as far as recruitment and retention? So how are we recruiting people? And who are we actually advertising to? And how are these job descriptions written so that we can be more inclusive? Because sometimes people have different types of experiences. And if you have a recruiter that's only looking at one type of experience, then you're going to miss out on a whole wealth of people that have different experiences, but that are similar to what the job is requiring. And then how are we retaining these folks once they're there? Because a lot of times, especially at universities, we see that there's a high turnover of people of color because they can be as diverse as they want to, but if they're not actually supporting people once they're here and in the organization, then it's really difficult to retain people. So that's why those ERGs are important. That's why being very transparent about pay and being very transparent about the family leave policy and anything else about how do we have a pipeline to the C-suite and what does that look like? And do we have mentors? So every organization should have a mentorship program of some kind. So that's really important too.
Well, lastly, Joy, give us a few resources. Well, as a professor, I imagine you have like pages and pages. Give us a few resources today on this podcast that we can all go check out and expand our knowledge of how we can support one another.
Well, you're right. I have a lot of resources, but I will say HERdacity, of course, is one of them.
Yay!
If you're looking for a job or looking for supportive networks, look for your local leadership networks. There's Lean In is in a lot of different places in different cities that you could look at. Fairy God Boss, Power to Fly, Leadership Austin, Impact Austin. They're always providing different resources. The Riveter is one. Social media, following different people on social media like Lily Zhang, Layla Saeed, Ijeoma Oluo, Roxanne Gay. Mary Frances Winters has a lot of great books for looking at having racial discussions in the workplace. Jennifer Brown talks a lot about queer identity. You know, I think the other thing to really look at is to understand what that is like for people that are different than you. So whatever your identity is, start seeking out podcasts and books around people that are different than you, getting a different perspective. So that might be Kimberly Crenshaw's Intersectionality podcast. It could be looking at Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples of the United States book. There's so many. I mean, I could go on and on, but that's where to start, just trying to get a different perspective.
And of course, there's your book, From Sabotage to Support, A New Vision for Feminist Solidarity in the Workplace by yourself and Dr. Camille Anderson.
Yes, that is a great resource. And we have a ton of resources in the back. We also have action steps throughout the book. And so we go from sabotage to support. So a lot of things I talked about, we expand upon in the book.
I love it. Thank you so much. Well, here at HERdacious, we are all about the sisterhood and supporting other women, obviously, whether bonded by blood or by choice. We all have that group of women that support us to the ends of the earth and beyond, our Femme family. The famous ones include the Schuler sisters, or for all you Hamilton folks, the Olsen twins, if you grew up watching Full House. We know the Middleton sisters, if you're into English royalty, and of course, America's TV royalty, the Kardashian sisters. But today, we want to spotlight a very sentimental, warm, fuzzy, close to my heart trio of sisters who never leave each other's side and are always encouraging each other to be the best that they can be, especially when it comes to kidnapping children on Halloween. Allow me to introduce you, or reintroduce you, to our October seasonal favorites, the Sanderson sisters. Before the Kardashians were squabbling on screen, there were the Sanderson sisters who, ironically enough, also chased that youthful LA look. For those of you unfamiliar with the Sanderson sisters, they are our three favorite witches from one of the most beloved of Halloween movies, Hocus Pocus. Now, Hocus Pocus tells the story of a teenage boy who moves to Salem, Massachusetts, and accidentally frees a coven of child-snatching witches on Halloween. How lovely. In honor of Halloween and a movie of perhaps unconventional sisterhood, we'd like to share a few fun cinematic facts about the movie Hocus Pocus. Number 1, while Bette Midler, Sarah Jessica Parker, and Kathy Najimy were the headliners for this film, some of you folks might not know that the perpetual Hollywood heartthrob Leonardo DiCaprio auditioned for the film. Leo was offered the role of Max, the teenage boy who released the sisters, and unfortunately, the Titanic superstar did us all a disservice by turning down the role. When questioned about this decision in recent years, DiCaprio said, and I quote, "I don't know where the hell I got the nerve." But apparently, he turned down the role, which was projected to be a box office success, because it conflicted with another role he really had his eye on, 1993's What's Eating Gilbert Grape. And he hadn't even auditioned for that role yet, so gutsy move, Leo. Number 2, sisterhood. Now, personally, I believe that sisterhood can transcend blood bonds through our own conscious choice of who we are and who we decide to surround ourselves with in our lives. An amazing example of this would be the singing, animal print-obsessed quartet, the Cheetah Girls. The director of the Cheetah Girls is Mr. Kenny Ortega, who also directed Hocus Pocus. In addition to these 2 films, Ortega was the cinematic mind behind a few other Disney films like Newsies and High School Musical series. Clearly, Mr. Ortega knows a thing or two about translating sisterhood onto the silver screen. His sister, Deborah Lee, must be so proud. And thirdly, let's talk broomsticks. According to an archived press release, Hocus Pocus's film choreographer, a Mrs. Peggy Holmes, specifically choreographed each of the Sanderson sisters to ride their broomsticks according to their character's style. Because Winnie is the trio's unofficial leader, probably because she's the eldest, she rode her broomstick with a more charge and aggression stance than her 2 sisters. And she always rode out at the front of her sisters when they flew out on their child-catching expeditions. Mary, the middle sister, rides her broomstick with more reservation. Supposedly, and I quote, like a good driver who signals with her hand. And lastly, Sarah flies with eagerness and confidence, always tilting her broom upward in preparation for launch. Check it out next time you get a chance to watch Hocus Pocus. And lastly, for all my fellow cat lovers out there, let's talk Binks. No Halloween movie about witches is complete without the classic black cat, and Binks was that black cat. Now, because the film was so long and the role required Binks in so many shots, doing tricks throughout the film and whatnot, Binks had to be played by 9 different felines, all of whom had different acting specializations like jumping, swatting, napping, being cute, etc., and not counting the amazing cat puppet who did all the talking. In a world where everything seems to be running amok, 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 it is important to just take a step back and unwind with a fun film like Hocus Pocus. Trick-or-treating and Halloween parties might be canceled this year, but there is no shame in buying a family-sized bag of Halloween candy, kicking back on your couch, in costume or otherwise, and enjoying the spooky spirit of the season with those you love. Just as you chose to spend your time listening to us today, we are choosing you to be one of our sisters on this journey. So, sister to sister, we'll be there for you in spirit, eating plenty of candy and supporting you on this wild ride we call life. Joy, my thanks to you for joining me in this wild episode today. I really appreciated all of the information and knowledge you brought to the table, and I feel like it's truly impactful to our audience.
Well, thank you for having me, and I really enjoyed the Hocus Pocus trivia.
Yay! If you enjoyed the show, as did Joy, my guest, I ask you to subscribe and please share the show with a friend who might need a little bit of magical support on their career journey. Until next time, remember that in the end, it's all just a bunch of hocus pocus.